Booktube, it's Kim at Middle of the Book March, and today I wanted to kind of present my mental health story. Mental Health May has been going on for this month, and we're at the last week of Mental Health May, the first read-along I've ever hosted, and my co-host is Marilyn Maya Mendoza. Her channel link will be below, and I wanted to develop this read-along to give exposure, to give transparency, to give information about mental health and mental illness. And May is Mental Health Awareness Month, not just on Booktube. So I thought this is a really good coincidence, or not, to do this read-along. And Marilyn, I approached Marilyn, and she's just such a wonderful, warm person. In case you haven't already realized that, just go and watch her channel, watch her videos. She's just awesome, and she's become just a wonderful Booktube friend of mine, and we talk on Voxer. We've been talking all month extensively, and we have the same goals. We just want to give transparency to the issues of mental illness and all issues of mental health. The other thing I really have enjoyed doing, and it's almost developed from talking about mental health and mental illness, is kind of showcasing people who have written books or have been part of literature who have thrived in spite of mental illness. We all see and know of stories of the stereotypical tortured artists. Artists who have taken their own lives, who have suffered with mental illness for years and then simply given up. Sylvia Plath, Ernest Hemingway, Van Gogh. There are all kinds of names that I could pull out of people who have given up on life because of either an undiagnosed or an untreated mental illness. Now, what I want to do today is talk about my own personal story. And Marilyn and I have both talked about talking of our own experiences. So that's what I wanted to do today. I was also inspired by Emily at Novell Novels, and I will link her video down below. She's doing the Spoonies read-along. And Spoonies, I think, I was unfamiliar with that term. I'm not sure if it's purely a British term, talking about mental health and invisible disabilities and invisible illnesses, and talking about how many spoons you have available to get through every day, whether you're dealing with invisible pain issues or a physical or a mental health issue. But she did her video story, and it just, I was so impressed by her, and I was cheering her on the whole time during the video, and I just had been thinking about talking about my own experiences, and she just gave me the mental kick to do it. So that's what I wanted to do today. I'm going to try not to make this video very long. So FYI, I'm going to try to keep it below a certain length, but I may not succeed. So we'll see how it goes. I've said at the beginning of the month when I was introducing Mental Health May that I was diagnosed with bipolar type 2 about 7 years ago. I was 50. And I'll be 57 in July. But let me talk about what led up to that. When I look back now and in my adulthood, as I've analyzed my childhood over many years of being in therapy and counseling, I grew up in a very chaotic home. I am the oldest of 5 children. My father was an alcoholic, as was my grandfather, as I assume were many of the men on my father's side of the family. My paternal grandmother was mentally ill with something undiagnosed, and she died before I was even born, not before I was born, but she died when I was an infant, so I never knew her. But the stories that my mother told me and a few situations that my father had talked about, it was clear that she had a mental illness of some sort. My mother had bipolar type 1. And her father was an alcoholic, and her mother was also mentally ill, again, with no diagnosis, but it was very clear. My maternal grandmother was the best grandmother, but she was not the best mother. And so on both sides of my family, going back pretty far, there were addiction issues, mental illnesses, whether they were diagnosed or undiagnosed. And back in those days, even if they were diagnosed, there were not very effective treatments available. So when I was a child, I grew up in chaos. I also grew up with a lot of younger siblings that I had to help take care of, even when I was 4 and 5 years old, because my mother, with bipolar disorder, was basically doing the best she could. But she had 5 children specifically because she wanted to prove to her family that she could raise 5 children better than her parents raised 5 children, of which she was the middle. And my father was at a bar, sitting at a bar, and he was drunk to the point of being passed out at the bar. And that's the first time my mother saw him, and she decided, that's who I'm going to marry. So that was their very quick story, and my mother happened to be pregnant with me as she got married. She got married in January, I was born in July. So when I look back at my childhood, yeah, there was all kinds of things. I had all kinds of strikes against me. My father was abusive. He was loud, violent, emotionally abusive, and drunk. And my mother, again, she was a very sweet, good person who didn't know what to do. And I knew back then that there were certain things that she did do that was really weird, really odd. I could not understand the choices she was making, but she was my mother, so you do what your mother tells you to do. And as a child, I always felt depressed, highly anxious, afraid of everything. Things were always dark. I could rarely see the positives, and I had very little optimism as a child. And I remember, because there were so many of us, we always lived in small homes. We didn't have a very big house. And I remember just wanting peace and quiet. And I would lay down on the living room carpet and try to put my face into the carpet, and I would fall asleep. And I would kind of be able to physically tune out the noise and tune out the chaos around me. And I would go into my own little world, and I would be asleep on the floor. And if I wasn't, I was put into service. I was a mother number 2. I was a babysitter. I was cook number 2. I was in charge of a lot of chores at a very young age. And this was all in the environment of yelling and screaming and fighting and crying and all of that. So I always felt very sad, and got to the point as I got older, when I entered puberty and beyond, my father started to switch. And I don't know if it was because I was a girl, I was a teenager, but he became a lot meaner. And so I didn't grow up with a very supportive teen years. I didn't grow up with a lot of guidance. My mother was more of a sit back and let things happen kind of a person. And she was also, grew up with so much baggage about her own self-worth that she didn't impart a lot of worth onto me. And for whatever reason, out of the 5 of us, I was the one who, I don't know, maybe seemed the saddest, until I, thought back later in my life of my middle brother, who I will get to in a little bit. But as I got to be an older teenager, I did everything later. I dated later. I didn't have a lot of life experience. I was not at all a confident person, a confident teenager. And I was very smart, always a reader, and books were my escape. So I always escaped through reading and books. I always had books. Even as a kid, I had the opportunity to always go to the library. I always had books at school. The Scholastic Book Fair was paradise to me. And I also was that quiet, studious kid. I didn't have friends at school. I had maybe 1 or 2, and it was I didn't like school for the social aspect. I didn't have a very good time at school. So there wasn't a lot of places to get away from it all. And that's what books did for me. As I got older, I was very smart and I knew I wanted to go to college, but I also came from a blue-collar family with parents who did not go on to further their education. They took some classes here or there, but I was told to go to college, but nobody helped me figure out how. And so I relied on guidance counselors and teachers. I got guidance through school. I did all the applications, all of the financial applications all by myself. And I did go to college. I did get accepted into college. I had to figure out how to get there myself. I had to figure out what to register for myself. I had to figure out what I wanted to do by myself. And most of my childhood, my mother used to tell me, "You're so good, I just don't even have to pay attention to you." And I'll never forget that, because that's all I wanted as a child was her attention. And it was so difficult to get it because I was the quiet one. I was a goody two-shoes in school. I did really well in school. My four siblings were either very young and needed care because they were so young, or they were into athletics, or they were into other things. They actually were getting into kind of minor skirmishes, so they always demanded a lot more attention than me. And I remember feeling alone all the time. Everything was dark and pessimistic and hopeless all the time. So finally I did go to college, and I went away to college for a semester. But I experienced, very early on, I experienced a sexual assault at college in my freshman year, and I left after the first semester. I also had some financial aid issues. And so me graduating with my bachelor's degree, I was the non-traditional student, and it took me 15 years to get my bachelor's degree. And I'm very happy that I did it, but it was definitely a non-traditional route. But as I came home from my first semester of college, my relationship with my dad just completely went just south, quickly. I tried to go away to college again. I lived with some relatives instead of paying to live in a dorm. I came back home when that didn't work out. And I remember it was just complete conflict and very contentious with my father. And I was 20 at this point. I was trying to go to school. I was commuting. And that's when my father ended up dying. He was driving home drunk from a party, and he crashed his car. He could have killed anybody else who was involved, but his car was the only one involved. So he died when I was 20. At the age of 21, I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown. All I could feel was just emotions always at the surface. I couldn't stop myself from crying. I couldn't get myself together. I couldn't work. I couldn't function. I couldn't think straight. And my mother forced me to seek out counseling, which was really odd because she had never really thought about it. It was recommended that she go as well after my father died. But I ended up seeking out counseling, and at the age of 21, I believe, was when I first started therapy. And from the age of 21 until my early 50s, I had been in and out of therapy and counseling over the years when I needed to go. And I did that my entire adulthood. But when I was in my 20s, and most of my 20s, even into my early 30s, I was told I had depression. And there was a lot of counseling. There was group counseling. There was individual counseling. A lot of self-help books. A lot of classes and research way before the internet. I know there was a before the internet. But I did all the reading I could because that's what I resorted to when I want help, when I needed help, I went to books. And so I tried to read as much as I could, and I thought I had depression. I went on medication. I tried several different antidepressants, Prozac, Wellbutrin, Effexor, nortriptyline, which is an older one. I think there were at least one or two other ones. There was one that began with an S. I don't remember what it's called. But for many years, my diagnosis was depression. But through the whole time, I felt like it's working okay, but it's just not enough. Something is not clicking. And even while taking medication, even while in therapy, my head was not clear. I wasn't figuring myself out. I was emotional. I was up and down. My mother used to call me moody throughout my whole childhood. I was making really poor choices. I would feel like I could be on top of the world, and then I would feel like I can't stop crying. And it wouldn't happen all in one day, but over time, it was back and forth and back and forth. I also felt an enormous amount of anger and anxiety, and I couldn't understand that because I had been going to therapy, I had been discussing my childhood, discussing all of my baggage, and I figured I've worked some things out. Why am I still so angry all the time? And it was when I had my first daughter. I got married at the age of 23 to my first husband, who I met in college. And we got married in May, and in September I was pregnant with my oldest daughter. And we were very happy, we were thrilled. And my pregnancy was uneventful, and I really enjoyed being pregnant. Her birth was pretty traumatic, and I'm not going to really talk about that here. But it was traumatic for me. She was healthy, and I didn't have postpartum depression, but I was physically a wreck. It was a traumatic physical experience for me, so it took me months to recover. I was crying all the time. I felt so stupid because I didn't know what to do. I'm a smart person, but having a newborn baby makes even the smartest person feel clueless. So it was really difficult for me to be a first-time mom. And I remember being angry and anxious and just couldn't get my nerves to calm down. So my daughter was between the ages of 2 and 3 when my marriage started falling apart. I was up and down, angry and anxious and depressed, and I had a few happy moments, a few optimistic moments over time here and there. But eventually we realized that our marriage was just broken and we couldn't fix it. And after my first husband and I separated and I was living on my own with my daughter, I remember getting so angry so many times that I was terrified I was going to hurt her. And that's what drove me into continuing to seek out what was wrong with me. And that was probably after I went and found another counselor, talked about medication. That was the longest period I had been on medication, probably until I met my husband, Andy, in 1997. So my daughter at that point was 6 years old. But even, as I said, even on medication, things were not right. I always was just angry, and I could never pinpoint why. I was worried all the time. I was moody. I was a worry wart. People, my family would, why do you worry so much? Why are you such a worry wart? Stop worrying all the time. And when you tell somebody with anxiety to stop worrying all the time, it just ratchets it up. It makes it worse. It doesn't do any good to tell a person with anxiety, stop worrying all the time. That's not how it works. So for many, many years, I just felt like, okay, this is my life. I just have to accept this. I'm going to continue to go to therapy to work on myself. I'm going to continue to read and work on myself, and therapy and read and work on myself. And I just accepted that that was my life. I never wanted to end my life. I never wanted to hurt myself. I always knew I wanted to live. I never wanted to die. And so I think that's probably what drove me to keep searching and working and trying to figure this out. After I got married for the second time to my husband, Andy, it was more of the same. We were married actually for 9 years before I got pregnant with my second daughter. So we had a lot of time I was a divorced parent, married for the second time. And so we had a lot of time when my daughter was with her dad. So we did have a lot of time on our own to kind of figure out our relationship. And we still struggled. It was a challenge. It's still a challenge at times because I just didn't understand myself. And I was trying so many things and I couldn't get a handle on what was wrong. There were months where I felt like I'm on top of the world. I can do anything. I'd be losing weight. I'd be working out. I'd been feeling great, and I'd have all this hope and optimism. And then a day later, I would be pissed off at the world, and I would just want to stay in bed and not take a shower and sleep and be in a room with the curtains drawn. I just could not, when I, at the time, thought that I couldn't get my shit together. And so many things happened. And after my second husband and I also got married in May. Got married in May of '98. And in January of '99, I found out my middle brother had taken his own life. He lived in San Francisco, and he jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge. He had a long history of drug addiction. He had been in prison for armed robbery. He had never been able to get his life together. He had never been able to hold a job, to go back to school. And he took his life in 1999. And at the time he said, I'm just so tired of trying to be happy. And that resonated with me because that's how I had always felt. I'm trying to be happy. I have to work at being happy. And we went from there. So I experienced an enormous amount of grief. My mother almost fell apart. We had put her on suicide watch. The family took turns staying with her. And over time, I dealt with that, and we moved on from there. Clara was born in 2007, and life went on. I continued to do what I do. I continued to work on myself. I was still going to school. I got my bachelor's degree before Clara was born, but I started graduate school in 2009, so she was about a year and a half at that point. It took me 8 years part-time to get my seminary degree, my Master of Divinity. I don't know how I did it, because I was a mess, and it was 8 years of late nights, 8 years of weekend plans that were canceled, 8 years of studying all hours of the day and night, 8 years of sometimes taking sick days from work to write papers. And it was only because of the support of my family that I was able to do that, because, and I also look back now and I'm surprised I didn't have any real mental health crises during that point. But I did manage to get my seminary degree. Again, my moods were all over the place. At this point, I was not taking any medication because antidepressants just were not doing it for me, basically. There was a lot of crying, a lot of anger, a lot of ups and downs, a lot of moodiness. At that point in my life, I wasn't really acting out in a kind of a low-key manic way. Because for bipolar type 2, it's not this type of extremes. It's kind of this, and you never know from one day to the next. I could be depressed one day and just want to stay in bed. The next day, I could be out all day. And I never got into any real trouble, not in my adulthood. I never did a lot of the things that hypermanic bipolar type 1 people would do. None of the stereotypical things. I still looked like a functioning person, a functioning member of society, quote unquote. But then later on, in 2012, my second brother, at 44 years old, died of a massive sudden heart attack. And it was traumatic for me because he was healthy, he was young, he was athletic, and I just fell apart. It's still traumatic for me. I still deal with it 11 years later. But I started going to grief counseling because I was already familiar with therapy. And so I knew I wanted help with this. So I went to grief counseling, and I met a counselor who I really liked, and she was working well, and we got along, we clicked. And so I talked to her for a little bit, and at the same time, my mother started getting sicker from diabetes. And my mother passed away almost exactly 2 years later in 2014. And I was still speaking to my therapist, and we started working on grief all over again. And I happened to make a comment in her office one day that my mother had bipolar type 1. And she looked at me funny and she said, "Did you ever tell me that?" And I said, "I thought so. That's kind of like my family medical history." And she said, "I had been suspicious that you may have bipolar type 2. Do you know what that is?" And I said, "I think I've heard of it, but can you explain it to me?" And as she was explaining it to me, I instantly started to sob, because it's like a light went on and I realized that is me. That's me. That's been me my whole life. And as she went on to describe it, she saw how the recognition come over me, and I could tell how much more animated she was getting. She said, "I can't diagnose you or prescribe medication, but I'm going to refer you to a psychiatrist. They will talk to you, and then they will tell you if you should consider medication." And that's what I did. I was referred to a psychiatrist. I went into his office, and he spoke to me for about an hour and a half and did kind of an interview of me. And we were done at that point, and I said, "So what do you think?" And he said, "Oh yeah, you have bipolar." And it was pretty instantaneous. He said, "It's very clear to me from your answers and from everything you told me that you do have bipolar type 2. And he went on to explain what that is. Bipolar type 2 is a chronic, more level form of bipolar disorder. I don't disappear for days at a time. I don't stay awake for days at a time. I've never had a psychotic episode. I've never been hospitalized. I've never overspent thousands of dollars. I've never been hypersexual. I've never been in dangerous situations, early in life maybe, but not to that extent. And there's a lot of research out there on bipolar type 1 disorder, which used to be called manic depressive illness. But bipolar type 2 was new-ish to me. And my counselor, my therapist at the time, gave me this book. And I've highlighted this on my channel before in books that helped me as we started with Mental Health May. This is one of the books I showed. But this was instrumental for me to learn what bipolar type 2 meant and what it meant for me and what it meant for my life. And the tools that it gave me to restructure my life so that it would be healthier for me and so that I functioned in a more positive way. And so I felt better. I did start medication. I take something called Lamictal, which is actually an anti-seizure medication, but it's also prescribed for mood disorders, which bipolar is a mood disorder. And so ever since then, about 7 years ago, life is just different. I understand myself better. The medication really works for me. I'm stable. But having a mental illness and having good treatment for it doesn't mean I'm cured. I won't ever be cured. I'm not perfect every day. I have bad days and I have great days. I have days where I just want to cry all day. I'm still very highly functioning, but having a mental illness means living with an illness. It means managing it. So I am aware it will always be there. I'm okay with that. I've restructured my life. I was able to restructure my life with a lot of help so that I'm successful and productive and far happier and content. And I know what my resources are. I know where to go. I know who to go to. I'm surrounded by so many supportive people, and not just the professionals who I pay for. So that is my story. I'm almost at 30 minutes. I'm going to quickly show you again books I've already showed you. This one is Don't Call Me Crazy. It's an essay collection edited by Kelly Jensen. There are a lot of essays in here from public figures who have a mental illness, whether it's depression, anxiety, or bipolar disorder. This was a very good collection to read. This one I just finished. This was An Unquiet Mind by Kay Redfield Jamison. I used this as a research tool for a paper, but I read it in its completion this week. And Darkness Visible, A Memoir of Madness by William Styron. the things that these books have in common, and is why I wanted to show them to you again, is these are great examples of people with mental illness who thrived, because William Styron has died long ago of natural causes in his 80s. But these are examples of people who are living with mental illness, not who have been defeated by it or not who suffer with one. And that's what I do. I live with a mental illness, as do so many people I know, and they do it successfully. And I do it in a good way. So that's the other main point that I wanted to get across for Mental Health May. Remove the stigma and give examples of people who thrive with a mental illness or in spite of one. So that's my story. I really appreciate you watching. I appreciate you listening if you've gotten to the end of this video. Let me know if you have any questions. I will try my best to answer them honestly. I am not afraid to do that. So please ask if you're wondering about anything. If you're curious, if there's an offensive comment or question, I will remove it. But I trust you guys. You commenters and subscribers are some of the best I've seen. And I really appreciate you. I appreciate all of you and some of the questions and conversations that we've entered into the comments. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.